Okay, so welcome to another deep dive.
Hmm.
This time you guys sent in something super interesting, a transcript
Mm,
from, like a podcast. But it's one of those podcasts that's meant for people learning English.
right.
And this one's, it's all about pharmacies and the kind of language that you use when you're at a pharmacy. So our mission today is to kind of go through this and figure out what are the most important words,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
phrases, the way people talk when they're in that situation.
Exactly. It's kind of like having like a cheat sheet or a phrase book,
Hmm.
for if you need to go into an English speaking pharmacy and you're like, "Oh my God, what am I going to say?" This will really help you out.
Yeah. So it covers a lot, right? Like we see some basic units of measurement, like milligrams,
Hmm.
different forms of medicine like capsules and tablets, price check,
Mm.
even just some of those really common phrases that you might say without even thinking about it, like be sure not to.
Yeah, hang on a sec.
Hang on a sec.
All that good stuff.
Yeah. 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 All right, so let's start unpacking all of this. And I think the best place to begin is with some of the fundamental vocabulary. So right off the bat, the transcript defines milligrams. We shorten it to milligram.
Right.
And this is something that I think a lot of us see on medicine bottles and stuff.
Hmm.
What's the real core thing to understand about that word?
Well, I mean, basically, a milligram is just a really, really small unit of weight. I mean, think about a gram. A milligram is like one thousandth of a gram.
Oh, wow.
Tiny, tiny.
Yeah.
But it's so important in medicine because it's how they measure out like the strength of a medication
Yeah.
or the quantity.
Yeah.
Whether it's a little kid's dose of something or like a really strong adult medication, a lot of times they're measuring those amounts in milligrams. So it's important to know what it means.
So it's like the airgram's little sibling that hangs out in the medicine cabinet.
Yeah, exactly.
Then we have price check. And on the surface, that one seems pretty self-explanatory, right?
Mm.
But the example that you pulled from the dialogue was it kind of added a human element to it. Don't you think? It
Yeah.
involves somebody discreetly inquiring about the cost of condoms.
Yeah, yeah, it was kind of funny, but
Right.
I think it really shows how, even a really simple question can like feel different depending on the situation. But at its core, a price check is just like, hey, can you tell me how much this thing costs?
Right.
Maybe because the price isn't clear or like maybe something rang up wrong at the register.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's a very normal thing to ask. And I think that little bit of humor just reminds us that, learning language, it's not just about like memorizing grammar rules. It's about how to deal with real life situations,
Right. Gosh.
even the awkward ones.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Okay, next up is prescription. This is one that we hear all the time, but the source material actually gives a really clear explanation of what it means and why it's so important.
Hmm.
So what's the main takeaway there?
Well, a prescription is basically like this. A doctor's note that you need to get certain medications. So if a drug is like, maybe it has a lot of side effects,
Mhm.
or it could be dangerous if you don't use it right. Or maybe it just needs like really careful management.
Okay.
You can't just buy it whenever you want. You need that doctor's note, that prescription,
Yeah.
to get it from the pharmacy. And it's all about safety, right? Making sure that people are using the right treatments and the right doses.
Right, it's a system of checks and balances.
Exactly,
Oh, yeah.
with medical guidance.
So that kind of leads us right into the discussion about capsules versus tablets.
Right?
Because in the dialogue, the pharmacist asks the customer, hey, which one do you prefer?
Mm-hmm.
And aside from just how they look,
Yeah.
what is the actual difference?
So, physically they're pretty different. Like a capsule is usually that little like oblong container,
Mm-hmm.
usually made of gelatin,
Okay.
and inside is the medicine. It could be a powder or a liquid. And then a tablet is like, solid, pressed together, often, like round or oval. And I think the transcript even talks about how, people might wonder which one's easier to swallow. And sometimes capsules, because they have that smooth coating, they can be a little easier to get down.
Interesting.
But it really can depend on the person.
So, I guess the shape and form of the medicine, it really can affect how we take it.
Totally.
Then there's another term that comes up in the dialogue, overdose. And I think we all know what that means in a general sense.
Right.
But the way the source material emphasizes it, It really kind of highlights how dangerous it can be.
Absolutely. Overdosing means you're taking more medicine than you're supposed to,
Right.
than is safe. And yeah, like the transcript says, it can have really bad consequences. I mean, it can make you very sick,
Yeah.
or even, lead to death.
Right.
So it's just a really important thing to be aware of, when it comes to medication safety. Always, always follow the directions on the label.
Yeah. And take it seriously. It's not something to mess around with.
Yeah.
And then we have, to wrap up the vocabulary portion, eye drops.
Yeah.
It, again, seems pretty straightforward, but the way they talk about it in the dialogue, it's a good reminder not to share eye drops.
Yeah, very important.
Right.
Eye drops are just liquid medicine that you put directly into your eyes. But you should never, ever share them with someone else because you can spread infections that way. So, yeah.
Good hygiene tip right there.
Always use your own bottle. Keep things clean.
Exactly. All right. So we've covered a lot of the key medical terms. I think we have a pretty good grasp on that. Now let's move on to some of the more, everyday phrases that popped up. And I want to start with be sure not to. The podcast mentions that it's kind of a softer way of saying don't.
Mm-hmm.
But what is the significance of that? Why does that even matter?
Well, I think it's really all about tone,
Right.
Be sure not to has this feeling of caution and guidance. It's like friendly advice,
Mm-hmm.
whereas don't can sound really harsh or demanding. And, when you think about those examples from the transcript, be sure not to take this on an empty stomach. Be sure not to exceed the recommended dose. Be sure not to share your eye drops.
Right.
Or be sure not to touch the tip of the bottle. Those are situations where a softer touch is really helpful, because it makes people feel more comfortable and reassured.
I think there's also something to be said for not making people feel anxious.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when they're already dealing with health stuff. It's like you want to put them at ease as much as possible.
Totally. And actually, this kind of gets at something even deeper. This small difference in language can actually play a huge role in whether or not people follow their doctor's instructions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, by phrasing things as friendly advice rather than strict orders, healthcare professionals can actually improve patient compliance. So it's not just about being polite. It's about getting better health outcomes.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So the words we choose really do matter.
Big time.
Okay, then we have, hang on a sec. And this one is definitely way more relaxed.
Oh, yeah, totally informal.
Right.
It's just a really casual way of saying, wait for a second,
Yeah.
Like the transcript says, you might also hear, hang on a minute or hang on a moment. But they all mean basically the same thing, just pause for a bit.
Right. And it's way more friendly than just saying wait.
Totally. Makes the whole interaction feel more comfortable and natural.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit here.
Right.
Because the transcript also gets into some, interesting cultural context around medicine and language.
Right.
And one of the key things is, what verb do we use when we talk about taking medicine?
Hmm.
And it seems so obvious, but I guess it's something that people learning English really trip up on.
It's true. In English, we say, take your medicine. So, you take a pill.
Okay.
You take a capsule.
Got it.
You take eye drops. And yeah, sometimes you might hear someone say, I ate my medicine, but that's not really correct, grammatically.
Right.
And most people don't say it that way. We reserve eat and drink for food and beverages.
Okay.
And this might seem like a really small detail, but it's all about clear communication, when it comes to your health. You want to make sure everyone understands what you're doing.
Right. Using the right word can make all the difference.
Absolutely.
And then we have this distinction between prescription and over-the-counter medicine, or OTC, as they call it.
Mm-hmm.
And, the transcript mentions that this can actually vary a lot from country to country.
Oh, totally. In the U.S., it's really strict. Prescription meds, you absolutely need that doctor's authorization.
Right.
And that's because, they tend to be stronger or they might have more side effects, and they often require more supervision.
Yeah.
But over-the-counter meds, you can just buy them right off the shelf. No prescription needed. If you have a headache and you just need some aspirin or ibuprofen.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and I think the transcript, it makes a good point about how the U.S. is known for having these really strict prescription requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows how, different countries can have really different approaches to medicine.
Yeah, it's super interesting how these systems, and even just the language we use to talk about them, can be so different around the world.
Absolutely.
And I think the dialogue itself from the podcast really brings all of this to life.
Yeah, for sure.
We hear the pharmacists, asking about capsules versus tablets,
Mm-hmm.
giving those important warnings about taking Proact.
Right.
Then there's that slightly awkward moment where somebody's asking for eye drops and condoms.
Classic.
Yeah, and then, of course, that price check that we talked about earlier. It's just hearing these words and phrases used in a natural conversation, it helps you understand how they work in the real world.
Yeah, totally. Context is so important when you're learning a language. And the dialogue from the podcast, it gives you that context. It's not just like definitions from a dictionary. It's
Right.
like real people talking in a real pharmacy.
Yeah, and I love that the transcript, it actually ends with like a question for the listener,
Mhm.
kind of prompting them to think about, like, how do medicine and pharmacies work in your own country?
It's a great question.
Right. Because there are probably a lot of similarities.
Mhm.
But I bet there are some key differences, too,
Oh, yeah.
in terms of, like, how you access medication,
Yeah.
the language that people use, maybe even just, like, the overall attitude towards pharmacies.
Totally. Like, think about it. Are prescriptions required for most medications where you live?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a clear distinction between a pharmacy and like a regular store that sells health products?
Yeah.
What kind of words do people use when they talk to a pharmacist in your native language? These are all really interesting things to consider.
Yeah. So I think we've really done a deep dive here.
Definitely.
We've broken down the essential vocabulary like milligrams, price check, prescription, the different forms that medicine comes in.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about the dangers of overdosing, common remedies like eye drops.
Mm-hmm.
We even went into some of those subtle but really important phrases like be sure not to
Right.
and hang on a sec.
And hang on a sec.
And I love that we also touched on some of the cultural nuances.
Yeah.
Like what verb do we use with medicine and what's the difference between prescription and over-the-counter drugs?
Hopefully everyone listening now has a much better understanding of this whole part of the English language.
Yeah, and how it all works in a real-world setting.
Absolutely.
So here's a final thought for you guys to consider. It's something that we touched on earlier, but it really struck me. Think about how these tiny choices we make in language, like whether we use a gentler phrase like be sure not to,
right.
instead of a more direct command, how that can actually affect how we interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And even like how we understand and follow important health information. Because the words we choose, they have power.
That's such a good point. It's not just about the words themselves. It's about the way they make people feel.
Right. And the impact they have on our actions.
Exactly.
So yeah, language is powerful stuff.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And be sure to send in your transcripts for our next episode. We'll see you then.
See you next time.
Bye.